we're going to hear a story about Diwali right now. But wait a minute. I think we have a special guest. We have a very special teacher who's going to come here to help us with this story.
I'm sorry, Mr.
You can call me Mr. Joe.
Mr. Joe. So today they need a story. Are any of you in kindergarten? Yeah, you are? Have any of you been in kindergarten? Oh, look at all of them. What do you do in kindergarten? You don't know? What did you do when you were in kindergarten?
Eat paste.
You know, Ms. Peabody, I thank you so much for accommodating us and wearing a mask. That must seem so strange to you.
Yes, I don't understand what we're doing.
But, you know, while you're speaking with us, you're welcome to take it off. Would you tell a story for our kids today?
Sure.
We know you're a renowned kindergarten teacher.
Okay. Well, you were going to tell a story about Diwali. And Diwali, if I remember correctly from my scriptures and learning, was a story that was about good and not so good. So let me tell you a story that Louisa May Alcott wrote for Ellen Emerson's, who was Dr. Emerson's daughter. And it was about fairies. Do you guys know what fairies are? Can you guys hold up your hands? And there's another one back there. Can you hold? Yeah, okay. So let's let one fairy be thistledown. This one's going to be thistledown. Now, thistles have prickers on them. So this is kind of a prickly fairy, okay? And this fairy is Lilybell. Can you dance with Lilybell for a moment here? Okay. So Lilybell was good, and she did all kinds of good things. She would bring the dew to the flowers in the morning. She would find extra nectar to slip into the flowers for the bees. She just loved doing good things. Thistledown loved doing what he loved to do. Does that sound familiar? Do you guys like to do what you like to do? Yeah, well, thistles have thorns on them, and they would he wasn't very careful, and he could rip the petals on the flowers. And he also got anxious, and when he'd see a flower that hadn't blossomed open yet, he'd pull back the green petals on the flowers to see if the flower was inside. That wasn't very good. Sometimes those flowers didn't make it because they were opened up too early. But Thistledown didn't care. Thistledown really only cared about what he wanted to do. Now, there was a Brownie King. Do you guys know what a brownie is? Yeah, what's a brownie? A brownie is a fairy, a very brown fairy, and they live close to the earth. And this Brownie King didn't like what Thistledown was doing, because all the funny things Thistledown was doing. So the Brownie King took Thistledown and held him captive in a rock where there was only just one little shaft of light that he could look out and see. And with that place, Thistledown couldn't hurt the flowers, but Thistledown was pretty sad. So along comes, who is this? Do you guys remember who this fairy is? Along comes Lilybell. So can you bring Lilybell out? Okay, and Lilybell's going to come and sing songs to Thistledown, okay? And be his friend in this really hard place, in this really hard time. And she came, and each day it got a little bit easier being in this hard place. But one day, she didn't come anymore. And Thistledown cried and cried and longed for his friend, and then thought, has something happened to my friend? Maybe she can't come because she's in trouble, and I'm held here in this rock. I can't get out and help her. Oh, please, if there's something that I could do, please, please let me do it. Well, the Brownie King came back, he opened up the rock, and led Thistledown to where he could find Lilybell sleeping. Can you hold out Lilybell sleeping? There she is sleeping on a beautiful open blossom with moss. She's sleeping quietly on the moss. And the Brownie King says that she is in a magical sleep and only can be awakened if Thistledown would go and get a gift from the earth spirits. So Thistledown looks far and wide. Can you make Thistledown go far and wide? There you go. And up and down. Yeah, Thistledown is looking everywhere, but Thistledown cannot find the earth spirits. So Thistledown sits down in the garden and realizes there are no flowers in this garden. And then realizes that, oh, there are flowers and they're all hiding behind their leaves, trembling in fear of Thistledown. So Thistledown realizes that that was not such a great thing to make them so fearful. And so he thinks, what would Lily Bell do? And what would Lily Bell do? She'd do something good, right? She would bring dew to the flowers. So Thistledown goes and collects the dew and puts it on the leaves and washes the leaves of the flowers. And he does this every day, day after day, until one day, as he's sprinkling water on a rose, the rose opens up and starts laughing. And he takes a moment to say, would you, Rose, happen to know where the earth spirits are? And the little rose says, well, yes. And called to Mole and said, Mole, will you lead Thistledown down deep into the earth to show Thistledown the earth spirits? So Mole and Thistledown go down deep into the earth, and there they find the earth spirits who are taking drops of water and watering the roots of the flowers and tending to the roots to make sure that they grow strong. And they tell Thistledown that, yes, they could give him a gift if he would help them work with them. And Thistledown is more than happy to do this because for Lily Bell, and realizing that he needs to change the way he's doing things. So he spends years watering the roots and making them strong until one day the earth spirits come and say, here is a little golden bell, and they tinkle it. Can you tinkle a bell? There we go. And so Thistledown takes this little golden bell back up, and the Brownie King says, this is good, and waves the bell, and Lily Bell wakes up. And she hears about all the things that Thistledown's been doing, and she is so proud of her friend that he has learned how to be kind and how to care about others around him. So, did you hear about that story when you were in kindergarten? No. Yes? Oh, good.
Well, we're talking about holding history this month. We're talking about today holding our collective spiritual history, our own spiritual histories. I remember 7 years old, I was playing that game, and that song, I'm surprised you didn't remember it, my mom here, because it was just hours of that song over and over. But we're held at that song with this Transylvanian music, our deep history back in Transylvania, and then our history with this, and that's what I was going to share with you today about the Concord, the Oracles of Concord, as it names in that song, in William Channing Gannett's song, the Oracles of Concord. But I think maybe rather than just preaching you a sermon about them, since we happen to have one of them among us, I don't know if you would consider yourself an Oracle of Concord, but you were certainly with them, right amongst them. Would you, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, would you just come up and maybe I could ask you a few questions if you'd be willing?
Certainly, Reverend.
So I know that you are famous for, we all remember you, right? Oh, because we just named our room for educating our smallest children after you. It's the Peabody Room, because we'd like to honor your legacy as a kindergarten teacher and as one of the first people to spread and start kindergartens all over the United States. But before I even ask you about that, I have to say, you knew William Ellery Channing quite well.
Well, yes, I first met Dr. William Ellery Channing when I was 8 years old, and he came to preach at our congregation in Salem. And upon hearing him speak, I was especially struck by how animated his delivery was, which felt like as if he were talking face to face with God. I mean, yes, he spoke about the importance of Jesus' life, but he also held us spellbound in sharing the secrets of nature. He could hold up a leaf and talk about how this leaf was pulled forth from the sun, which was millions and millions of miles away, sending a warm ray down to pull it out of the ground and to have the stem blossom into leaves and flowers. And how the sun gave the leaves colors, and how they then breathed back all this beautiful perfume. And it was a connection with nature, I think, that gave us a sense of the holy, and a God who was very present and loving, not this distant, wrathful God that from stories long ago.
He must have been an incredible preacher. I've tried to read some of it. We've saved copies of his sermons.
I hope you should. I published them for you to be able to do that.
We did. I should admit, though, that the 19th century prose is rather challenging to read for most of us.
And also my reminiscence of L. Channing, that was hard for you to read as well? That was written later.
Well, I am afraid to say that wasn't on the Ministerial Fellowship Committee required reading list, but I'm so glad that you did, because we do remember him still in these lives, that we are still talking about the very same things that Channing was so enamored with, and that's why it was a member of this congregation, Ann Crew, who got that road named after him leading up. Thank you, whoever it was on chat who mentioned that. It really is, we have people with us who are not in the room, I know.
Angels.
Yeah, sort of like angels, yes. But so beyond his preaching, which again, it must have been really amazing to have left a legacy with 200 years, we're still talking about his work. You knew him quite personally.
Well, yes, after hearing him preach, I couldn't stop thinking about Channing and talking about him. And eventually, a woman from the Boston congregation invited me about 5 years later to come up and listen to him speak. And I was able to meet him personally. And he asked me, what was interesting that was happening in Salem at that time? And he listened as I poured out my heart about all these wonderful things that we were doing in Salem presently. He was always interested in listening to children. And he said that one should talk with children, not to children. Mm-hmm. And when I returned home to Salem, it became my ambition to, when I was of age, to escape Salem and to go to Boston in order to understand the cultural riches and theological controversies that were happening there at the time. And when I was able to return, I started a school, and I went to his sermons all the time. But the school did not succeed, and I closed it after a year, and I had to then take up a governess position in Maine for some Unitarian families, prominent Unitarian families, until I was able to then return again to Boston. This time, having corresponded with him, he was able to then give me the connections that I needed to be able to start another school, which thrived for years because of those connections and wonderful support of his. And it was at this time that I was able to attend the parlor conversations that he had, and eventually I ended up having every Saturday night dinner with him and his wife, and I would tell him about the conversations I was having with my students, and he was very interested. And oddly enough, I started to find that the salient parts of those conversations started ending up in his Sunday sermons. And so it continued like that until one day his health failed, and then at that same time then was the support that he was giving to the school, and the support for the school dwindled, and I had to close the school again.
That's a tragedy, but I'm just enraptured by this idea of being so close in to those theological controversies that you're talking about, these ideas, to have been so, to be drawn forth by your own interest in them and then get to have such an impact. I mean, we're still, again, having the ripples of those conversations about what is human nature and what is our relationship with God, what is God, the ways that you all had those conversations we're still wrestling with today. So what did you do, though, after the school closed?
Well, my sister Mary and I went to a boarding house. It was there that we met Mr. Horace Mann. And many people in town thought that we were courting, but in the end he ended up marrying my sister Mary. Horace did encourage me, however, to write articles for the Christian Registry, and that brought in some money. And eventually, I accepted an offer to teach at Mr. Bronson Alcott's new school on Temple Street.
Wow, so Horace Mann, who of course was the congressman who first championed public education in our country. Well, I won't ask you any more personal questions about the courting, but he then, through the Christian Registry, you got to Bronson Alcott, who we, of course, remember for his daughter's stories, Louisa May's books. But
yeah, the one I told was just one of many books. In fact, her famous book was Little Women, right?
Of course.
And so she named the 4 little women after the 4 sisters in her family. And the child that was born after her was named Elizabeth Peabody Alcott, after me, because that they were so enamored by the work that I was doing with him. And so then that Elizabeth became Beth in the story.
That's amazing. I had no idea. And you were then teaching with him?
Yes. Yes, he was an idealist, and he used very radical Socratic teaching methods. You wouldn't think this was radical because Socrates was from so long ago, but this was radical in New England. And in the beginning, my teaching methods were very compatible with Mr. Alcott's, because he encouraged the children to think. But Alcott's starting place was the idea that we all had a pre-existing spirit inside of us, and that he believed that once the children were aware of that spirit and that spark of spirit within them, that they would understand the local and universal expression of justice and be moved to act benevolently. For me, however, I believed in more practical things like the Unitarians. The practical application of Unitarian optimism, that we are all inherently good as humans, and that by providing children with what is just and fair, that they will come to know their own duty to be just and fair in their endeavors. I advocated play for children. Bronson pushed that children should endeavor to do introspection on themselves, and I found the students weren't responding to his methods of self-examination. However, through play, children could come to know what was right themselves.
It's interesting. I've never thought, I guess, about the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists. I know it was a real controversy, and that many of the folks we revere as our Unitarian ancestors, maybe I'll ask you about some of them soon, they were Transcendentalists who were really rejecting the Unitarianism of the time. There was a controversy between them.
Oh, but Channing always preached, whether it was the strong Puritans who needed to keep to their very solid ways and their structures, or it was the Transcendentalists who were imagining other ways of looking at things. He always believed that we should be embracing each other and loving each other through all of this.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and why the movement held together. But to understand it concretely as the Transcendentalists looking for that introspection inward, and the Unitarian looking for a little bit more of a tangible external reality, and the approach to teaching it less. But so there was some other controversy, though, at the school. Some controversy, I think, that it's been echoed a number of times since, even in our last couple of decades, around our commitment to sexuality education.
Yes, well, 2 years later after teaching, I left the school because Alcott had introduced the idea that love resulted in babies. And this was an idea in New England that was not really ready. The townsfolk were not ready to have this taught to their children. And I recognized this, and that such teachings would not be well received, so I chose to leave the school. And the scandal did follow, which only increased Alcott's reputation at the time, but eventually even he had to close the school. But as a woman, my reputation would have been severely damaged, if not even destroyed, and I would not have been able to teach again. But as a man, he could take such a risk and still find occupation.
Right. Well, and I want to ask you about some of the women of the time, but I can't help myself. I just have to. You must have known the Oracle of Concord, the Sage of Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Oh.
How did you meet Emerson?
So at 18, I left home to establish this private girls' school. And I was wanting to learn to read and write Greek. I knew Latin and many other languages, but I didn't know Greek, and I wanted to understand that as sort of the basis of things. And there was a recent Harvard graduate, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was willing to teach me. He was only 19 at the time, and he refused to take any payment that I offered for these lessons, perhaps because he was enthralled with our meetings. I certainly was enamored by him. But we struck up a friendship in those years before he entered the divinity school and was ordained. A path I think he chose because of his father and his upbringings. And while in school, he met Ellen. And they courted for 2 years, waiting for her to be 18 so that they could be married. And everything was going well for him. He had a loving, supportive wife. He graduated first in his class at Harvard Divinity School, and he was being offered a junior pastorate position at a prestigious church in Boston. But it was short-lived. Because Ellen died 2 years later, and he was deeply grief-stricken. And he went to her gravesite every day to be with her. And losing her, it shook his faith. And eventually he decided that he couldn't, in good conscience, be a Christian, let alone to pastor and perform the sacraments and duties of a pastor.
There's such a strain of solitude in his work. I never thought about that coming out of his grief over Ellen dying, but perhaps that's what set him on that path.
Yeah. However, leaving ministry was a freedom for Mr. Emerson. He could pursue teaching and lecturing, and there were many lecturing possibilities at that time, and so then he could use his gifts well and became very popular and used his influence in other people's lives. In fact, we remained friends throughout our lives, and I was the one who introduced him to Nathaniel Hawthorne in hopes that Hawthorne's writings would profit from Mr. Emerson's endorsement and his prestige.
So you knew the famous writer Nathaniel Hawthorne as well?
Yes. I recognized his writing potential, and I invited him up to Boston to see if we could find a way to get his writings published. And this led me to introduce him to my family and to Mr. Emerson. Mr. Hawthorne was also interested in me, but he ended up marrying my youngest sister, Sophia.
So now you've mentioned several men who showed an interest in you, men whose minds are remembered to this day, but you never married?
I had no interest in marriage. That would be the end of my independence. You see, as one of my brother-in-laws stated, a marriage would halve a woman's rights, but double her responsibilities. I loved my freedom, and I needed my independence if I was going to open schools and write textbooks and operate a bookstore, publish articles, and manage a periodical. I think you call them magazines. My sisters and married friends, they could only write or produce their art with their husband's permission, and many of them had to publish under their husband's name, and none of them could own a business.
So by sticking to your own inner truth, your own calling, following your path of independence is how you were able to be the proprietress of the West End bookstore, the famous bookstore that was so central to the Unitarians of the time. And what was that like for you to run a bookstore after wanting to be a teacher?
I had a wonderful library at the bookstore. It consisted of both domestic and foreign books, and I had especially new French and German books. There it was that I came in contact with the world as never before. The Ripleys were starting Brooks Farm. They were friends of ours, and they were at the bookstore. And Theodore Parker was beginning his career and all of his wonderful teachings. And all of these things were discussed in my bookstore by Boston lawyers and Cambridge professors. Those were very living years for me.
I can imagine. I want to ask you all about the Ripleys and Brook Farm, that utopian experiment, but the Theodore Parker and all of it. There's so much I could ask you, but well, why don't I say these conversations that were happening, that was where Margaret Fuller was hosting conversations, wasn't it?
Yeah, indeed it was. I met Margaret Fuller when she was 18, and I was 24, conducting my School of Girls in Boston under Channing's influence. And I'd heard of Fuller before. She was a child prodigy and was well known. But I could use my connections to help her writings get published. And eventually, I talked Emerson in getting him to invite Margaret up to Concord. And when I left teaching at Alcott's school, Margaret was the one who was able to step in and take my place. But shortly after leaving the school, I started these, what you're calling conversations. We conducted reading parties, and they were lectures at first mostly for small groups of women on various literary and philosophical topics in return for the price of a ticket. And when we first started these, I was the first one to arrange such speaking parties as a woman. So I reached out to Margaret because we both recognized the need for an opportunity for women to be educated. I mean, even Margaret, as brilliant as she was not allowed to attend college until years later. So many intelligent and inspirational women attended those circles and benefited from what Margaret discussed.
Say some more about who those women were, because I you know, as I read history and learn about the history of our faith, these names, Emerson and Channing and Thoreau and Parker, all these men who are remembered. But beyond you, Margaret Fuller, there aren't very many women of that time who we remember. Who else?
Well, there were the Sturgis sisters. Ellen was probably the most gifted poet in New England at the time. In fact, Thoreau used one of her poems in his book on Walden. And Carolyn Sturgis, she wrote these classic children's books, but history has failed to notice, probably why you don't hear of her name, because of her impact on Emerson. If you read her correspondences with Emerson, you will see that she greatly influenced his writings. Mm-hmm. And in attendance to Margaret's speaking events, there was also Carolyn Healy Dahl. Do you know her?
No.
She was a great writer and ethicist, and she was the one who argued that women were no longer content to be in the domestic sphere and should be allowed to participate in public life. I mean, we all believed in this sentiment, but it was Carolyn who stated it so boldly. Many women who attended these reading events became involved in securing the rights for women and abolishing slavery, but you probably don't hear of them as much.
No, and thank you for sharing about some of them. I'm curious if you would say, for you, that it must have been, as a woman publisher in that day, momentous to be publishing these works that, again, we do remember and changed the world. What were some of the highlights for you of being a publisher?
Well, there was such a need to publish so much of the information. It needed to be distributed more widely, and Channing's works, for example. But then there was the thoughtful young man, Henry David Thoreau, whom Mr. Emerson had befriended. I mean, he artfully wrote Civil Disobedience. And I was the first to publish it, to get it out there. I put it in my first edition of my periodical, Aesthetics. But I also...
I just have to say that it's, to me, the most important piece of writing that he did, and he did a lot of beautiful writing, but that's the piece that inspired Gandhi, and in turn King, and I mean, the civil rights and the movement for peace around the world, nonviolence, that he articulated in that essay, it had a powerful impact. And you published it. That's amazing.
I was the first to publish it. It got published again and again. Thank goodness we were able to get it out into the larger circles. But another one that I published that was very important to me was Sarah Winnemucca's story, A Life Among Paiutes. When Sarah arrived in Boston to lecture about the tragedies and wrongdoings that were done to the Paiute people, we were captivated in hearing her story. So my sister Mary helped her transcribe it down, her lectures, which I then edited and published in order to spread the information further. And so touched were we by her plight, though, that we, as well as others, sent money to support the schools to open for the Paiute children.
But I heard those schools, that they were never built, that Sarah couldn't explain where the money went.
Well, perhaps you should have looked at it from her perspective. Just as the schools were about to be constructed, the Dawes Act came into effect, making Paiutes American citizens. But it also required that all the Paiute children be sent off to boarding schools where they would learn English. And as for the money that was spent, Sarah couldn't account for it because her Anglo-Saxon husband had gambled it all away.
Oh. I see it's like so many stories of the past. The way we tell it is more about our own cultural lens, perhaps, than the facts. To imagine that Sarah Winnemucca was an incompetent administrator helps to reinforce our story that Native people were childlike or uncivilized and in need of some kind of caretaking. And really, I guess it goes back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago, the Bible stories that the Puritans imagined the Native Americans playing out again, like the Canaanites who needed to be cleared out of God's land so God's chosen people could inhabit it. It makes me wonder about this biggest story about you, though, that your legacy was to start a movement to make kindergartens available across the country. Will you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, in my time, kindergartens were the private domain of the well-to-do and were considered only a marginal experiment at best. But I believe that each child deserved to receive an education. I was influenced by my brother-in-law, Horace Mann, who believed that public education could create citizens who would then celebrate democracy and work to eradicate social justice. And I was at a party of Margaret Schultz, the wife of a Wisconsin politician, when I met her daughter, Agatha, a student who had attended a German language kindergarten. The child was a miracle, so childlike and unconscious, and yet so wise and able. And she was attracting the influence of the other children who seemed nothing short of enchanted by her. And this work that had led her to be like this was the work of Frederick Froebel, who rejected that fear-based discipline that was so prevalent in our time and emphasized the importance of fostering children's curiosity and about nature and their own senses of it. Froebel also believed in avoiding excess introspection with the very young, so I'm very glad you let the children leave and not have to be a part of our discussions. And this actually resonated with me after my experience with Mr. Alcott's Temple School. So next year, I opened a public kindergarten in Boston. And after a while, I began to wonder if I was really doing it right. And so I left for Germany to then study and observe under this German model that was being practiced by his disciples. And when I returned, I could not let this valuable information circle only in Boston. So I started traveling across the country, giving lectures and holding training classes. My sister and I published several guidebooks, and I also published the periodical Kindergarten Messenger. Do you know of it? To establish and maintain more public kindergartens. But Reverend Leifert, I think we've spoken a lot about me. you came with a sermon for these lovely people. I presume there's still another hour left that you could do that?
Well, thank you, Ms. Peabody, but actually, no, we're actually just about at our time. We've shortened the length of sermons since Channing. 2 hours. Can you imagine preaching 2 hours? Guess if you're not watching any TV, that might work. So all artifice aside, I do want to say this. We too, I think, live in a moment that history will reflect on. And when I think about everything that we're facing today, all the challenges that are so imminent, I feel them daunting, to say the least. How can we hope to bring about the scale of change that's needed? But somehow listening to these stories of one Unitarian's life, the stories of the amazing people around her, the ordinary people around her, I do think there's some hope to be had in history. Like those who came before, we still seek racial justice, the abolitionists who Elizabeth Palmer Peabody worked with. Like those who came before, we want to care for children, that all children should have the opportunity to grow and flourish like plants in the garden, the kindergarten, right? Whose particular needs are tended to. As events unfolded in Glasgow this week, I thought about the vision of world peace that Peabody and so many of our spiritual ancestors held, a vision that still calls us on, that still inspires each of us to pursue whatever small part of that vision we can wrap our own lives around in love. When I think about the people we've talked about today, the generation or two who, through their passion for new ideas, for justice and nature and children and growth and possibility, who through bookstores and periodicals and parlor discussions reshaped the religious and cultural landscape of a country, I am daunted by the idea of trying to live up to this legacy. But when I remember that they were also just people, doing their best, listening to one another, weaving connections and following their passions, who knows who among us might introduce Emerson and Hawthorne, might convene Fuller's discussion group, might educate their children in such a way to start a movement. As Margaret Mead so succinctly put it, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Or, as a contemporary hero of our tradition, Reverend Wayne Arneson says, take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. May it be so, and amen.